Act 1. The Graduation Day Haze. Lila stood at the edge of the high school courtyard as the morning sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the assembled graduates. The late summer air was crisp, carrying the sweet tang of cut grass and the undercurrent of something unspoken. And every breath she took felt both electric and heavy with promise. Around her, her classmates chattered excitedly in caps and gowns, their voices a mix of joyful anticipation and the tender sorrow of farewells. Proud parents milled about, their faces beaming with pride, while teachers smiled, their eyes hinting at both encouragement and wistful endings. Yet amid the celebration, Lila felt a quiet undercurrent of disquiet. There was a distant, low rumble that she couldn't quite place, like a heartbeat from deep within the earth, and a fleeting shadow at the periphery of her vision, dancing just beyond the familiar. She turned her gaze to the stage, where names were being called with deliberate pride. Each announcement seemed to carry with it the weight of the future, as if the simple act of receiving a diploma was a promise of endless possibility, and a reminder of all she was leaving behind. Lila's thoughts churned. The upcoming transition to college promised new beginnings, but it also pulled her away from the comfort of the known, from a life that was slowly unraveling into something altogether more mysterious. In that moment, as she clutched her graduation cap and listened to the soft murmur of her peers, Lila felt the stirring of an undefined destiny. There was a yearning deep within her, a longing for something beyond the predictable cadence of everyday life. It was as if the low rumble in the distance was calling her, echoing secrets that the sunlight could not dispel. Shadows, too, seemed to whisper of hidden truths and ancient magic, hinting that her journey was far from ordinary. The ceremony continued, and with each name that rang out, Lila's heart beat a little faster. The air was alive with the promise of change. Beneath the surface of the celebration, the ordinary had begun to dissolve, replaced by the shimmering edge of the unknown. In that fleeting moment, as laughter mingled with the soft susurrus of an unseen world, Lila knew that her life was about to change forever, even if she didn't yet understand the full measure of its pull. The sun had begun its slow descent, slanting golden light through the trees, turning the small neighborhood park into a place of soft shadows and flickering warmth. The air was thick with the scent of late summer, dry grass, warm pavement, and the faint floral sweetness of blooming honeysuckle. Lila walked beside her best friend, Harper, their steps slow and unhurried along the winding dirt path that curved around the pond. Graduation was over. The cap and gown had been folded into a neat bundle in her car, and the speeches and handshakes were already dissolving into memory. The celebration had been cheerful, full of promises of bright futures and endless possibilities. But now, away from the crowds, away from the weight of expectation, Lila felt the strange hollowness settle back in. "Are you excited?" Harper asked, her voice light but edged with something else. She already knew the answer. Lila gave a half-hearted shrug. "I guess. It's weird, though, like I should be feeling more, I don't know, something. It's supposed to be this big moment, right? The start of something new?" She let out a breath, scuffing her sneaker against the gravel path. "But I just feel like I'm waiting for something else." Harper shot her a look, both knowing and amused. "That's just nerves. College is a huge change. You've been talking about getting out of this town since forever." Lila nodded, but the words felt hollow. This was different. This wasn't the restless, youthful impatience she'd always carried, eager to escape small-town predictability for something bigger. No, this was something else entirely. A tension that coiled just beneath her skin, an awareness that buzzed at the edges of her senses. Something was shifting inside her, something that had nothing to do with textbooks and dorm rooms and orientation days. She didn't know how to explain it, not even to Harper. The strange dreams, the feeling of being watched, even when she was alone, the way her heart sometimes raced for no reason, as if responding to some unheard call. "I've been having these weird dreams lately," Lila said, keeping her voice casual, "running through the woods. I can feel the wind on my face, the ground under my feet, but it's not me. At least, not like I am now. It's like I'm something else." Harper wrinkled her nose. That's not ominous at all. Lila smirked. Yeah, it's probably nothing, just stress. But even as she said it, she knew she didn't believe it. Stress dreams didn't leave you waking up breathless, heart hammering, lungs burning as if you'd actually been running for your life. Harper nudged her with an elbow. Maybe you're psychic. Or like a past life is trying to reach you? Lila laughed, but the sound felt brittle. Or maybe I just need to stop binge-watching weird horror movies before bed. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the distant croak of frogs blending with the soft ripple of the pond. The quiet should have been calming, but Lila couldn't shake the sensation that something unseen hovered just at the edges of her awareness. It was like standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting for the ground to shift beneath her. Harper bumped her shoulder. Hey! Whatever's going on, it'll work itself out. And if not, we'll just add haunted to your college application. Might make you stand out. Lila rolled her eyes. Yeah, just what admissions is looking for. Applicant experiences unexplained supernatural disturbances. Harper grinned. If nothing else, I'd read that essay. Lila laughed, shaking her head, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. The feeling wasn't going away. Something was coming, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. The moonlight spilled through the window, silvering the edges of Lila's room, turning familiar shapes into something foreign and strange. The soft hum of the night filtered in, the distant chirp of crickets, the rustling of wind through the trees outside. The world was quiet, still. Then the dream came. Lila was running. Not in the slow, sluggish way dreams usually played out. No, this was different. Her body was light, fluid, powerful. Each stride carried her forward with exhilarating speed, muscles stretching, contracting, working in perfect harmony. The scent of pine and damp earth filled her lungs as she moved through the dense forest, her breath sharp and clean in the crisp night air. The moon loomed overhead, impossibly large, a glowing beacon against the dark sky. Its light touched everything, setting the leaves aglow with silvery edges, making the ground shimmer as if dusted with frost. The wind cut against her skin. No, not skin. Fur. Thick, warm, moving with her as she raced between towering trees. Lila wasn't running away from something, she was running toward it. A distant howl rose in the night, and the sound sent a shiver through her. Recognition, longing, the undeniable pull of something familiar. It wasn't a lonely sound, nor was it a warning. It was a call, a summons. Her heart pounded in answer, matching the rhythm of the earth beneath her paws. She should have been afraid, but there was no fear, only the thrill of movement, of power. The sharp snap of twigs underfoot, the rustle of leaves as she brushed past, the scent of something wild and electric in the air. It all felt right, as if this was where she belonged. She crested a small hill, the forest stretching endlessly before her, dark and endless and alive. Her lungs expanded with the deep inhale of freedom. The wind carried another howl, closer this time, familiar. Not alone. She turned toward the sound. Her instincts told her she would find answers there. Then, just as she was about to take another step, the world shifted. A jolt ran through her body, a sudden lurch that sent everything spiraling. The trees blurred, the night twisted, and the moon, so full, so brilliant, tilted wildly before shattering into fragments of silver light. Lila woke with a gasp. Her body jerked upright, her breath coming fast and ragged. The room was too small, too still, the air too thick. Sweat dampened the back of her neck, clinging to her spine like a ghostly touch. She swallowed hard and forced herself to slow her breathing. Her hands trembled as she reached up, touching her face, her arms. No fur, no powerful limbs meant for running, just skin, just Lila. But the dream clung to her, more than a fleeting wisp of imagination. It was still in her blood, in the way her muscles ached as if she had truly run through those woods. The scent of pine lingered in her nostrils. Outside her window, the moon hung in the sky, bright and full. She stared at it, her heartbeat steadying, but that deep, unfamiliar part of her, the one that had raced through the forest, stirred. Somewhere in the distance, so faint she might have imagined it, a howl rose in the night, and her heart ached to answer it. Lila woke to the sound of breathing, not her own, not inside the house, but close, just outside her window. Her eyes snapped open, her pulse hammering as she lay still, listening. The room was bathed in the soft light of early morning, streaks of gold slipping between the curtains. Everything looked normal. Her cluttered nightstand, the half-empty water bottle, the stack of books she'd meant to put away but never did. But something was wrong. The dream still clung to her, thick and lingering like morning mist that refused to burn away. She could still feel the damp earth beneath her feet. No, beneath her paws. Still hear the distant howl, the way her body had responded to it like a song she'd always known but never sung. And now, awake, the world felt different. A dog barked somewhere down the street, sharp and frantic, but it wasn't just the sound she noticed, it was the intent behind it. There was a rhythm, a pattern, something off about the way it echoed through the quiet neighborhood. It wasn't just barking, it was warning. A breeze stirred the leaves outside, and Lila caught the scent of wet grass, asphalt warmed by the rising sun, something sharp and musky that didn't belong. Her breath hitched, her senses stretching out instinctively. Too far, too sharp. The rustling of leaves became a whisper of movement. The creak of a fence 2 houses down told her someone, or something, was there. She sat up slowly, eyes darting toward the window. The air outside looked still, the street empty except for a few parked cars and the lazy roll of a plastic bag drifting along the pavement. But that didn't mean she was alone. Swallowing against the tightness in her throat, she threw the covers off and padded barefoot across the floor. The wooden planks were cool under her skin, grounding her even as her pulse refused to settle. At the window, she lifted the curtain just enough to peek through. Nothing. Just the street, just the trees, just the ordinary morning in her ordinary town. Except she could still feel it. That presence. That awareness pressing in on her skin like the weight of an unseen gaze. Lila took a slow breath and told herself she was being ridiculous. It was just a dream, a weird, vivid, unsettling dream, nothing more. And yet, she reached for the window latch before she could talk herself out of it and slid it open. The cool morning air brushed against her face, stirring the hair at her temples. She closed her eyes and inhaled. Damp earth, bark, the lingering scent of something wild. Her heart stuttered, because it wasn't just a scent, it was familiar. A shiver traced its way down her spine, but not from fear. The night before, in her dream, she had been running, and now, standing in her too small room, the sun rising over a world that should have still felt normal, she realized something. She wasn't running away. She was running toward something, and whatever it was, whoever it was close. Dusk settled over the town like a slow exhale, stretching the shadows long and deepening the blue of the sky. The last glimmers of daylight clung stubbornly to the rooftops, but beyond the streets, past the last rows of neatly trimmed lawns and fences, the forest loomed, untouched by the fading light. It had always been there, the town pressing up against its edges like an overeager guest, overstaying a welcome. But tonight it felt closer. Lila stood at the boundary where the pavement ended and the wilderness began. A worn dirt path snaked its way into the trees, vanishing into the undergrowth. She shouldn't be here, and yet, here she was. The air smelled different out here, thicker, alive in a way the town wasn't. The scent of damp earth and pine mingled with something else, something she couldn't quite name but recognized all the same. It was the same scent that had woken her that morning, curling in through her open window like an unspoken invitation. Her pulse ticked up as she took a step forward. She didn't remember making the decision to come here, not exactly. It started as a feeling, a restless hum beneath her skin, a pull that had begun the moment she had opened her eyes that morning and hadn't let go since. It wasn't logical, wasn't reasonable, But she had learned in the last few days that logic had little to do with whatever was happening to her. Another step. The packed dirt was cool beneath her sneakers, the crunch of dry leaves sharp in the quiet. The forest swallowed the sound. Lila hesitated, her fingers curling into fists. The pull was stronger now, an invisible thread drawing her forward, laced with a sense of urgency that she couldn't ignore. A warning bell rang softly at the back of her mind. This was how people in horror movies died. Girl follows mysterious urge into the woods. Cue ominous music. Except this didn't feel like danger. It felt like home. She stepped deeper into the trees. The last rays of sunlight barely touched the canopy here, turning everything into a shifting mosaic of light and shadow. The deeper she went, the more the air changed. Cooler, wilder. Something primal stirred beneath the surface, a silent rhythm that seemed to sync with the beating of her heart. Then she saw the markings. At first they looked like scars on the trees, the kind left by time and weather, but as she stepped closer, she realized they were deliberate. Symbols, carved into the bark, rough but distinct. Some were deep gouges like claw marks. Others were more intricate, loops and slashes that held meaning just beyond her grasp. She reached out, fingertips grazing one of the symbols. The wood beneath her touch felt warm. Her breath hitched. The last time she had touched a tree, it had been just a tree. But now the world felt different, like it was waiting, like it was watching. A whisper of movement behind her. She froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Slowly she turned. The forest held its breath. There was nothing there, just trees, just shadows. But the feeling remained. You are not alone. Lila swallowed against the dryness in her throat. She should leave. She should turn around, walk back to town, shake this off as some weird, lingering effect of too many sleepless nights. But she didn't move. Instead, she pressed her palm flat against the carved symbol. The warmth of it pulsed against her skin, a heartbeat that wasn't hers. And deep in the woods, something answered. The deeper Lila walked into the forest, the quieter the world became. The usual nighttime sounds, chirping crickets, the rustle of wind through the trees, had faded, swallowed by the kind of silence that wasn't natural. It wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, the kind of hush that came when something unseen was holding its breath. She felt it before she saw it, the weight of a presence, not just one, many. It started as a prickle at the base of her neck, the undeniable sensation of eyes tracking her every move. Her pulse picked up, an instinctive reaction, though whether it was fear or something else she wasn't sure. Lila wasn't the only one out here. The full moon had begun its slow rise, its silver glow filtering through the canopy, casting fractured light onto the forest floor. The shadows stretched long and unfamiliar, shifting as she moved, as if the trees themselves were alive and watching. She scanned the darkness, her breath tight in her chest. Nothing, no movement, no sound, and yet a flicker, just at the edge of her vision. Something darted between the trees. Too fast to be human. Too large to be anything else. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Not alone. The thought wasn't terrifying so much as it was inevitable, as if a part of her had known, even before she stepped foot in the forest, that she would not walk this path unseen. She pressed forward, slow and cautious, her senses stretched too far, too sharp. Every rustling leaf, every shifting shadow sent another jolt of awareness through her. Something was out there, more than one, close enough to touch, but they stayed in the dark, just beyond her reach, watching, testing her. She broke through the last of the thick brush and stumbled into a clearing. It wasn't large, just a small open space tucked between towering trees, the grass soft underfoot. The air smelled stronger here, rich, wild, laced with something musky and deep that sent her pulse skittering. The full moon hung just above the tree line now, bathing the clearing in cold silver light. At the center stood a low, flat stone, worn smooth by time. Symbols, similar to the ones she'd seen carved into the trees, had been etched into its surface, their meaning just out of reach, teasing at the edge of her mind like a half-remembered song. But it wasn't the stone that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the discarded clothing beside it, a shirt. Torn, dirty, crumpled like someone had pulled it off in a hurry. Nearby, a pair of shoes, half buried in the grass. Lila swallowed hard. A person had been here, recently. She crouched down, reaching out, but the moment her fingers brushed the fabric, a snap of movement behind her sent her spinning. The shadows at the edge of the clearing shifted. Shapes. Silent. Watching. Lila's breath came in shallow gulps, her skin prickling with the undeniable certainty that whatever was out there wasn't human. And for the first time since stepping into the woods, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The clearing held its breath. Lila stood frozen, her heartbeat thundering in her ears, drowning out everything but the silence pressing in around her. The forest had been full of unseen watchers, of shifting shadows that never quite revealed themselves. But now, something was stepping forward. A figure emerged from the tree line, moving with the kind of fluid grace that belonged to something predatory. Tall, broad-shouldered, his presence filled the space in a way that had nothing to do with his size and everything to do with what he was. The moonlight caught in his dark hair, glinting off the sharp angles of his jaw, but it was his eyes that held her still. Glowing, not a trick of the light, not a reflection. His eyes burned with something too wild, too intense to be human. Lila's breath hitched. She had seen eyes like that before. In her dreams. He stopped a few feet away, standing in the pool of silver light that illuminated the clearing. Close enough for her to make out the tension in his frame, the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides like he was fighting the urge to move. Close enough that she could see the faint rise and fall of his chest, slow and measured, as if he were keeping himself carefully contained. A quiet, dangerous stillness settled between them. She should have been afraid. She was afraid, but it wasn't fear that kept her feet planted in the dirt. It was something else, something deeper, older, as if her body already knew what her mind hadn't yet caught up to. The man. Aiden, she thought, though she didn't know how she knew his name, tilted his head slightly, studying her the way a wolf might assess an unfamiliar scent on the wind. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low, edged with something rough and quiet, like the distant growl of thunder. Lila swallowed, but her throat was dry. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over her thoughts. She didn't have a good answer. "I don't know." His gaze flicked over her, sharp and assessing. "You shouldn't be." There was weight behind those words, a warning, a command. Lila bristled at the tone, even as a part of her, one she didn't want to acknowledge, responded to it. "I didn't exactly plan on wandering into your Ibuzers." She gestured vaguely at the clearing, at the discarded clothing, at the strange symbols carved into the stone. "Whatever this is." Aiden exhaled, something close to a sigh, but not quite, more like frustration barely leashed. "This isn't a place for you." "Yeah?" Lila lifted her chin, ignoring the way her pulse stuttered when his gaze sharpened. "Well, I'm here now." A muscle in his jaw ticked, his shoulders tensed. Something flickered in the shadows beyond him. Lila wasn't sure what was worse, the feeling of being watched before, or the fact that now she could see them, shapes shifting at the edges of the clearing. Too large for humans, too still for animals. And suddenly, the torn clothing beside her took on a much more ominous meaning. Her stomach tightened. "You're not alone." "No?" Aiden said, voice unreadable. Lila's fingers curled into fists. She should run. She should. But some deep, stubborn instinct rooted her to the spot. "Who are you?" she asked, voice quieter now, but steady. For a long moment he just looked at her. Then finally he answered. "The one who keeps people like you alive." clearing was no longer empty. Lila wasn't sure when it had happened, when the forest had exhaled its hidden occupants into the space around her. One moment, she and Aiden had been alone in the silvered light, and the next, the trees had given birth to them, silent figures watching from the shadows, blending into the night like they belonged to it. Her pulse stumbled, but she held her ground. Their presence wasn't obvious. They moved like ghosts, half-glimpsed and shifting at the edges of her vision, their shapes just human enough to make her question whether she was seeing them at all. But she felt them, felt their weight pressing in around her, felt their eyes as keenly as she felt the cold air brushing against her skin. Aiden hadn't moved, hadn't looked away from her. But she could tell he was aware of them, as much a part of them as the trees were part of the forest. "That this isn't a place for you," he said again, voice even, measured. But this time there was something else under it, something less like a warning and more like inevitability. Lila's breath came fast, her thoughts tripping over themselves in an effort to make sense of what was happening, the symbols, the discarded clothing, the way Aiden moved, like something untamed, something only pretending at human. The way the others waited in silence, the way the night itself seemed to hold its breath. "This is real," she said softly, not a question, a realization. Aiden's gaze didn't waver. "Yes." The world tilted slightly beneath her feet. Lila had felt it coming. The dreams, the pull, the way the night whispered to her in ways she couldn't explain. But hearing it, having it confirmed by the man standing in front of her, made it something she couldn't ignore. Her throat was dry. "Who?" She swallowed and started again. "What are you?" A flicker of something crossed his expression. Amusement, maybe? Or something colder. "You already know," he said. And God help her, she did. She didn't want to. She wanted to laugh it off, call him insane, pretend she hadn't spent the last week waking up from dreams that smelled like pine and blood and freedom, pretend she wasn't standing in a clearing surrounded by things that looked like men but felt like something else. But the truth sat heavy in her chest. "You're wolves," she whispered. The forest didn't deny it. Aiden inclined his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "We are." The words shouldn't have made sense, shouldn't have fit in a world of high school graduations and dorm room assignments and morning coffee runs. But they did. The others shifted in the shadows, restless now, their presence growing more tangible, more real. The whisper of feet against dirt, the soft exhale of breath, the scrape of nails, claws, against bark. Lila felt them circling her, felt the energy shifting, coiling, waiting. She looked back at Aiden. He was still watching her, still steady in a way that made her stomach twist. Not kind, not cruel, just certain. "There's more," she said. "I don't just walk into your forest and find this place by accident." His jaw tightened. "No." No further explanation, no reassurance, just a single word, spoken with the weight of something far bigger than either of them. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, her breath sharp. "Ask, don't ask. Walk away, run. What does this have to do with me?" she asked instead. Aiden's lips pressed together in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're here." That was all he said, as if that was enough. Lila took a step back, but the trees behind her felt closer than they had before, their gnarled limbs pressing inward. "You came here," they seemed to say. "You followed the call." Her heart pounded. "This isn't over, is it?" she murmured. Aiden studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, "No." Something in the air shifted. An invitation. A promise. And maybe, just maybe, a threat. The cabin smelled of cedar and smoke, the firelight flickering against the dark wood walls, throwing long shadows that stretched and curled like something alive. Lila sat stiffly in the worn leather chair, hands curled around the mug Aiden had placed in front of her. The tea was hot, herbal, unfamiliar, but it grounded her, something warm to hold on to, while the rest of her world tilted wildly out of place. Aiden stood near the hearth, staring into the flames. He hadn't spoken in a while, but the tension in his shoulders said plenty. The weight of something heavy, something old, pressing against his spine. Lila had questions, so many questions, but the silence between them was fragile, like frost on glass. One wrong word, and it might shatter. She lifted the mug to her lips, took a cautious sip. "So," she said finally, voice low, careful, "you said I wasn't here by accident." Aiden turned, slowly, his gaze sharp even in the dim light. "You weren't." She waited for more, but he only watched her, his expression unreadable. Lila exhaled sharply, setting her mug down. "You're going to have to do better than that." Something like amusement flickered in his eyes, quick and gone, before he leaned against the mantel, crossing his arms over his chest. "You want the short version or the long one?" "Give me the version that actually makes sense." Aiden nodded once, considering, before he spoke. "The pack isn't just a group of shifters. It's bloodlines, it's history, it's—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's balance, order. There's a reason werewolves don't just run wild, don't tear through the world unchecked. We have laws, rules. Because without them, we're just animals." Lila swallowed. He said it like he'd seen it before, like he knew, firsthand, what happened when those rules were broken. Aiden continued, his voice measured. "The alpha holds everything together, keeps the pack in check. If we're strong, the pack is strong. If we fall, everything falls with us." His gaze flickered to her then, sharp, assessing. "You stepped into our world, Lila, and that doesn't happen by accident." She shifted in her seat, something cold settling in her stomach. "I don't even know what your world is. You're starting to." Lila clenched her hands together, frustration bubbling up beneath her skin. "I'm human," she snapped. "I have finals next month. I was supposed to be worrying about college, not—" She gestured vaguely at the cabin, at him. "This." Aiden's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Maybe you were." Something about the way he said it made her stomach twist. She shook her head, forcing out a laugh that sounded too brittle even to her own ears. "This is insane." "You're talking about fate like I'm supposed to believe?" "You feel it." His voice was quiet, but it stopped her cold. Lila swallowed, pulse stuttering. "You knew the way through the woods. You knew something was calling you," Aiden said, pushing off the mantle. He took a slow step forward, his presence filling the space between them. "You knew me before you ever saw me." Her breath caught, because he was right. That deep, unsettling recognition, the way her body responded to his voice, to his presence, it had been there from the beginning. Aiden knelt in front of her chair, his movements slow, deliberate. "There's a reason for that," he said, watching her carefully. "And I don't think it's a coincidence." Lila's fingers dug into the fabric of her jeans. "Then what is it?" she whispered. For a moment Aiden just looked at her. Then he reached out, hesitant, giving her time to pull away, before pressing his palm against her wrist. The moment his skin touched hers, something surged through her. Heat, energy, recognition. Her breath hitched and Aiden tensed, his own breathing turning shallow. "It's you," he murmured, almost to himself. "You're—" He stopped, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was saying. Lila's skin burned where they touched, but it wasn't pain. It was something else, something old and powerful and terrifying. Aiden let go first, sitting back on his heels, eyes dark and thoughtful. "This isn't over," he said. "Not for you." Lila swallowed against the lump in her throat, her pulse hammering in her ears. She knew, somehow, that he was right, and that scared her more than anything else. The night had settled into something softer, the forest wrapped in the hush of a waning moon. The fire inside the cabin had burned low, leaving only the occasional pop of embers behind the wooden walls. Outside the air was cool, edged with the scent of damp earth and pine. The wind whispered through the trees, stirring the leaves with something that felt like breath, like movement just beyond sight. Lila stood at the edge of the porch, arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the vast, untamed stretch of wilderness beyond the clearing. It was quiet. Too quiet. As if the world itself was waiting. She heard Aiden before she saw him, the soft creak of wood as the cabin door swung open, the near-silent footfalls as he stepped beside her. "You're not afraid?" His voice was low, unreadable. Lila didn't turn. "I should be." The words felt strange on her tongue because they weren't exactly true. She had been afraid. Earlier, when shadows had shifted in the trees, when she had first looked into Aiden's glowing eyes and realized that her world wasn't what she thought it was. But now? There was something else. Aiden exhaled through his nose as if amused. I've seen plenty of people react to the truth. Most of them run. She finally looked at him. "And you? What did you do?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, his gaze flickering over her face, searching for something she wasn't sure she had the answer to. The moonlight painted his features in sharp relief, turning the angles of his face into something almost unreal, like a creature born of darkness and silver. Then, without a word, he reached for her. Lila barely had time to react before his fingers brushed against the bare skin of her arm just below the sleeve of her jacket. The world tilted. A jolt of heat surged through her, startling, electric, sinking into her bones with a weight that made her breath catch. It wasn't just warmth. It was recognition, a force, ancient and undeniable, wrapping itself around her like a second heartbeat. Aiden's eyes darkened, his fingers tightening just slightly against her skin. He felt it too. Lila's pulse pounded in her ears, her senses roaring to life. The wind carried new scents she hadn't noticed before. The deep musk of the forest, the faint coppery tang of something older than time itself. The distant sound of rustling leaves was too sharp, too distinct, like she could pick out each separate movement. Aiden swallowed. His grip didn't loosen, but there was something wary in the way he looked at her, like he hadn't been expecting this either. "This is impossible," he murmured. Lila shivered, though she wasn't cold. "What is this?" Aiden let go abruptly, his fingers leaving behind a warmth that lingered, spreading through her like a brand. "We'll pack," he said, voice rougher than before. "We're connected to each other, linked, but this—" He shook his head, exhaling sharply. "You're not one of us." His tone should have been certain. It wasn't. Lila flexed her fingers, staring at the place where he'd touched her. The sensation hadn't faded. If anything, it had settled deeper, like a thread tying her to something vast and unseen. "Then why do I feel like I am?" she whispered. Aiden didn't answer, not with words, but the way he looked at her then, like she was something unexpected, something important, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moon hung heavy in the sky, round and pale, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, rich with the scent of fallen leaves and something older, something wilder, that Lila had only recently begun to recognize. She stood in the center of the clearing, her breath curling in the cool night air, her muscles already tense in anticipation. Aiden circled her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator assessing prey. "You're too stiff," he said, his voice calm but edged with something firm. "Relax." Lila let out a breath, rolling her shoulders. "You say that like it's easy." Aiden stopped behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "It will be," he said. "Eventually." She wasn't sure she believed him. The last few days had been a whirlwind of impossible truths, and half-formed instincts clawing their way to the surface. She still wasn't sure what she was. Not a werewolf, but not entirely human anymore either. Aiden seemed to know, he just wasn't telling her yet. "Close your eyes," he instructed. Lila hesitated, then obeyed. "Breathe," he said, quieter this time. "Listen." She did. At first she only heard the usual sounds of the forest, the distant chirping of crickets, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, but as she focused, the sound sharpened. The chirping wasn't just noise, it was a rhythm, a pattern, almost musical in its consistency. The rustling leaves weren't just moving randomly. Something was there, shifting through the underbrush. A small animal, maybe. A rabbit or... "Good," Aiden murmured. "Now, scent," Lila inhaled. Her head snapped up, eyes flying open. Aiden was watching her, his expression unreadable. "What did you catch?" She swallowed. "You..." He arched a brow. "You smell like... fire. And wood smoke? Something else?" She frowned, tilting her head slightly, sorting through the unfamiliar sensations. "Something sharp." Aiden's lips twitched, just slightly. "Good." Leah let out a slow breath, trying to steady the rush of adrenaline surging through her veins. Everything felt clearer, like she had been walking through the world half asleep, and now suddenly she was awake. The realization sent a thrill through her. Aiden stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Now, movement!" Before she could ask what he meant, he lunged. Lila barely had time to react before he was on her, but something in her body moved before her mind could catch up. She ducked. Fast, too fast. Her instinct screamed at her to move, and she obeyed without thinking, twisting to the side just as Aiden's arm shot past her. He pivoted smoothly, barely thrown off balance. "Better!" Lila stared at him, breathing hard. "You attacked me." "You're learning," he said simply. She scowled. "What if I hadn't moved?" His expression darkened just for a second. "Then we'd have a bigger problem." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver through her. Lila straightened, rolling the stiffness from her shoulders. Again, Aiden studied her for a long moment, then nodded. And this time, when he moved, she was ready. Act 2. Training under moonlight. The night had settled into stillness, the sounds of the forest now familiar rather than overwhelming. The adrenaline that had surged through Lila's veins during training had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Not just physical, but something heavier, something that curled up in her chest and refused to let go. She sat by the edge of the pond, her reflection rippling in the dark water, distorted and unfamiliar. Aiden was behind her, quiet, watching. He hadn't said much since they had stopped, letting the silence stretch between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt weighted, charged with something unspoken. Lila let out a slow breath, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt beside her. "I should be better at this." Aiden stepped closer, crouching beside her. "You're learning?" She huffed a humorless laugh. "Am I?" She glanced at him, frustration tightening her chest. "Because I don't feel like I am. One second I think I've got it, and the next I'm flat on my back wondering what the hell just happened." Aiden tilted his head slightly, considering her. "That's how learning works." Lila shook her head. "You make it look easy." His lips curved, but there was no humor in it. "It's not." She turned her gaze back to the pond. The moon hung high above them now, its light turning the water silver. "Did you struggle when you first started?" Aiden didn't answer right away. The silence stretched long enough that she almost thought he wouldn't. Then, finally, "Yes." Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. Lila shifted to face him, drawn by the quiet weight in his voice. "What happened?" Aiden's jaw clenched. He stared out at the water, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't supposed to lead," he said after a moment. "I was never meant to be alpha." Lila blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected. Aiden's gaze flicked to hers, something guarded behind his eyes. There was someone else, someone better suited for it, smarter, stronger. He exhaled slowly. "But they didn't make it, and the pack needed someone." Lila swallowed. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't have to. The way his shoulders tensed, the way his voice dropped just slightly, told her enough. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Aiden sighed, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. "You're not weak, Lila." She let out a breath, shaking her head. "You don't know that." "I do." His voice was firm, certain, in a way that made something in her chest ache. She met his gaze, the firelight from the cabin flickering in his dark eyes. He wasn't trying to placate her. He wasn't saying it just to make her feel better. He meant it. The moments stretched between them, something shifting in the air. Lila's pulse skipped, but she didn't look away. Aiden did first. He stood, glancing back toward the trees. "We should head back." Lila hesitated, then nodded, but as she followed him through the woods, the weight of his words settled into her bones, warm and steady. Maybe she wasn't weak. Maybe she wasn't meant to run. The fire in the cabin burned low, sending flickering shadows along the rough wooden walls. Lila sat across from Aiden, waiting. He hadn't spoken in a while, not since they'd returned from training, not since she'd asked the question that had turned his expression unreadable. "How did you become Alpha?" Aiden stared into the flames, his jaw tight, his hands loosely curled around the edge of his chair. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, but then, "Run!" The word, shouted against the roar of wind and breaking branches, echoed through his skull. The memory crashed over him like a wave, dragging him backward to a night long past. Then the forest was burning. Not with fire, not in the way humans feared, but in the way of battle, growls and snapping jaws, the sickening crunch of bone, the scent of blood thick in the air. Aiden was younger then, barely 20, still reckless, still naive enough to believe strength alone would be enough to protect those he loved. His brother Elias stood in front of him, blood streaked across his jaw, his breathing ragged. "You have to go," Elias snarled. "Get the others and run." Aiden shook his head. "No." Elias turned, his golden eyes flashing in the moonlight. "This fight isn't yours." The rival pack, led by a man Aiden had once trusted, had come for blood, for power, for dominance. Elias had been the rightful alpha, the strongest, the best of them, and still it hadn't been enough. Aiden could still see the moment it happened, the way Elias dropped to his knees, one hand clutching his side, dark blood seeping between his fingers, the moment Aiden realized he wasn't strong enough to stop it, the moment the burden of leadership was shoved onto his shoulders, whether he wanted it or not. The night the world had made its choice for him. Now. Lila's voice pulled him back. "Aiden!" He blinked, the cabin coming back into focus, the crackling fire, the warmth of Lila's presence across from him. She was watching him closely, her expression unreadable. She had seen the shift in him, the way his body had tensed, the way his breathing had slowed, caught in the weight of memory. "You lost someone," she said softly. Aiden let out a breath, long and slow. "Yeah." Lila hesitated. Then, quietly, "Elias." Aiden's gaze snapped to hers, something sharp flashing in his expression before it faded. Lila's fingers curled against her knee. "I saw it," she murmured. "Not everything, just pieces. The bond, the strange, undeniable connection between them. It wasn't just one-sided." Aiden looked at her for a long time before he finally spoke. "He was supposed to be Alpha," he said, voice low, rough. "Me?" Lila didn't say anything. She just let the silence stretch between them, warm and steady. Aiden ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I never wanted this." Lila's voice was quiet, but sure. "But you didn't walk away." A ghost of a smile tugged at his lips, humorless. "No." Because walking away meant leaving the pack unprotected. It meant letting the ones who had taken his brother win. It meant failing, and Aiden didn't know how to do that. The fire crackled between them. Lila shifted, her gaze never leaving him. "You think I'm like you," she said finally. "That I'm meant for something bigger than I ever asked for." Aiden met her eyes. The weight of the past pressed against him, but when he looked at Lila, there was something else. Something lighter, something unfinished. "You don't have to want it," he said. "But that doesn't mean it won't find you anyway." Lila's breath hitched slightly, but she didn't look away. Neither did he. The fire had burned low, its embers casting a deep orange glow against the stone hearth. The air inside the cabin was warm, thick with the scent of wood smoke and something quieter, heavier. Lila sat on the worn leather couch, her legs curled beneath her, watching Aiden with the kind of patience that felt unnatural for her. She wasn't used to waiting for answers. But something told her that pushing him wouldn't work. Aiden sat across from her, his long frame stretched out in a chair that looked as tired as he did. His elbow rested on the armrest, fingers pressed lightly against his temple, as if holding something at bay. Minutes passed before he finally spoke. "I should have saved him." His voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the crackling fire, but Lila caught every word. She didn't have to ask who he meant. Aiden's gaze stayed on the flames, unreadable, but his body, so often controlled, so steady, was tense, his muscles drawn tight beneath his skin. "I was younger," he said, the words clipped, measured, not weak but reckless. "I thought strength was enough, that if I just fought hard enough I could hold everything together." A wry, humorless smile pulled at his lips. Elias knew better. He understood the weight of it all. He knew what it meant to lead. Lila swallowed, her chest tightening. "And you didn't?" Aiden exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "No, not then." His jaw clenched. "When the challenge came, I told him we should fight, that we could win if we just—" He stopped, dragging a hand through his hair. "He told me I was an idiot." The ghost of a smirk flickered across his face, and for a second Lila saw the brother Aiden had lost, the bond they had shared, the way grief had hollowed something out inside him. Her voice was softer this time. "But you fought anyway." Aiden's fingers curled against his knee. "He did." Lila's breath caught. Aiden finally looked at her then, and his expression was raw, stripped bare in a way she hadn't seen before. "He stepped in for me." His voice was steady, but just beneath the surface she could hear it. Guilt, sharp and deep, settled into the cracks of his bones. He thought they would listen, thought reason would be enough to stop it. Lila felt something heavy settle in her stomach. But it wasn't. Aiden shook his head once, barely a movement, but it held the weight of an entire past he could never change. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The fire popped in the hearth, the wind outside whispering against the cabin walls. Then, softly, "It wasn't your fault." Aiden let out a low breath, his fingers tapping once against his knee before stilling. Maybe. He looked away. Maybe not. Lila watched him, the man who had carried too much for too long, a leader who had never wanted the title, a brother who had never meant to survive. And yet, despite all of it, he had stayed. That realization settled in her chest, something deep and warm. "You're still here," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Aiden stilled. His head tilted just slightly, his dark eyes catching hers. Lila's throat tightened. "You could have left, could have run, but you didn't." Aiden studied her for a long time, and she wondered if anyone had ever said that to him before. Then, finally, he let out a breath, slow, steady, and something lighter than before. "No," he murmured. "I didn't." Lilia nodded, and the space between them felt smaller than it had before. She didn't know what that meant, but she knew, without a doubt, that whatever this was, whatever weight Aiden carried, whatever path had led him here, he wasn't walking it alone anymore. The meeting place lay deep within the forest. where the trees grew ancient and thick, their trunks gnarled with time. The air smelled of damp earth, pine sap, and something older, something woven into the roots of the land itself. Lila followed Aiden in silence, her breath tight in her chest as they descended into the heart of the pack's hidden sanctuary. The natural amphitheatre was carved into the earth, its walls formed by towering slabs of stone that arched overhead like the ribs of some great beast. Torches lined the edges, their flames flickering in the night air, casting elongated shadows that twisted against the rock. She had never seen anything like it. The floor was packed dirt, worn smooth from centuries of use. At the centre, a circular stone slab stood embedded in the ground, covered in etched symbols that glowed faintly in the firelight. Some she recognized from the trees in the forest, marks of territory, protection, but others were unfamiliar, older, their meanings lost to time. The pack was already gathered when they arrived. Wolves and humans alike stood in a loose circle, their gazes flicking toward Lila the moment she stepped into the light. She felt the weight of it, the scrutiny, the quiet judgment. Some faces were unreadable, others openly wary. A few looked downright hostile. Aiden barely hesitated, his presence commanding as he took his place at the head of the gathering. The pack parted for him instinctively, the way animals did for something larger, something more dangerous. Lila had seen him fight. She had felt his strength firsthand. But here, among his own, there was something else in the way he carried himself. Not just power, but responsibility. The weight of an alpha who had not asked for his title, but bore it all the same. A low murmur rippled through the gathering as the last of the pack settled. Then an older man stepped forward, his face lined with age, but his posture still straight. His silver-streaked hair was pulled back, and a leather cord wrapped around his wrist, decorated with small carved bones. Tokens of rank, of history. Lila had heard the name before, murmured in the shadows of the pack, spoken with a mixture of respect and wariness. The eldest of the council, the one who had once stood at Elias's side. His gaze flicked to Lila, sharp and assessing. "You bring a stranger into our sacred place, Alpha." Aiden's expression didn't change. "She isn't a stranger." A few murmurs at that. Lila stiffened, resisting the urge to cross her arms. "She is not one of us," another voice said. A woman this time, her dark eyes narrowed in open disapproval. "And yet she walks among us, trains with us. What are we to make of that?" "She was called here," Aiden said, his voice calm but firm. "And we don't ignore a call." A pause. Then Donovan's expression darkened. "A call, or a risk?" Lila felt something cold curl in her stomach. Aiden's jaw tensed. "She has done nothing to harm this pack." Donovan held his gaze. "And yet she stands here, at our council, in a place no outsider has ever stood." Lila exhaled sharply. "You think I want to be here?" The words left her before she could stop them. "You think I asked for any of this?" The murmurs rose again, louder this time. Aiden shot her a look, half warning, half impressed. Donovan, however, studied her carefully. "No," he said after a long moment. "I don't think you asked for it." His voice was quiet, but it carried through the gathering like the crackle of distant thunder. "But that doesn't mean you aren't dangerous." Lila's throat tightened. She could feel it now. What they feared. It wasn't just that she was human. It was that she wasn't just human anymore. She had felt it in the woods. The way her body had known how to move, how to react. The way the pack symbols had recognized her. The way Aiden's touch had awakened something inside her. Something the pack couldn't explain. And wolves did not trust what they did not understand. Aiden's voice cut through the rising tension. "We don't cast out our own, Donovan." Donovan's gaze flicked back to him. "And is she ours then?" Silence. The fire crackled, the wind shifting through the trees. Aiden's voice was steady when he spoke. "She will be. A challenge. A promise." Lila's breath hitched, but she didn't look away. Whatever this was, Whatever path she was walking, there was no turning back now. The council gathering had ended, but the tension clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. The pack dispersed in murmurs, the flickering torchlight casting jagged shadows as wolves, some still in human form, others shifting as they melted into the trees, moved back into the night. Lila lingered at the edge of the gathering, her pulse still thrumming from the confrontation. Aiden had claimed her, not in a way that bound her, but in a way that changed everything. She will be. The words rang in her ears, settling under her skin like something more than just a declaration, like a promise or a threat. Aiden had left her alone for a moment, drawn into a quiet conversation with Donovan and a few of the elders. Lila had stepped back, needing space, needing air. But as she moved toward the outer edges of the meeting site, voices drifted toward her from the shadows. Low, She stopped just before they noticed her, half hidden behind the rough bark of an ancient oak. She should have left, should have turned and given them their privacy, but then she heard her name. She shouldn't be here. The voice was male, deep and edged with barely restrained anger. You saw it. He all but named her pack. Lila held her breath, her fingers pressing into the grooves of the tree. She isn't one of us. A second voice now, female, clipped and cold. Whatever she is, she doesn't belong. She's human. A pause. Then, is she? Lila's stomach turned, a scoff. She's something else and you felt it. The way the council hesitated, the way the forest has been watching her. The voice dropped lower. We don't know what she is, but Aiden does, and that's why he's keeping her close. Silence. Then the woman spoke again, softer this time. He's playing a dangerous game. A shuffle of movement, someone exhaling sharply. He's a good alpha. He's a reckless one. The words sent a chill down Lila's spine. Aiden had told her there would be resistance, that not everyone in the pack would welcome her, but she had thought it would be wariness, distrust. This was something else. This was rebellion. A faction within the pack, waiting, watching, wondering if Aiden was fit to lead them at all. The realization settled heavy in her gut. A rustle of leaves signaled movement. Lila stepped back, retreating into the darkness before they could see her. Her breath came fast, shallow, her fingers trembling at her sides. They didn't trust her. They didn't trust Aiden. And if she was a threat to their way of life, if they believed she would weaken them, they would not hesitate to remove her. She swallowed, her heartbeat steadying. They thought she was a danger to the pack. Fine, she would prove that she wasn't, and if they wanted to fight her, then she would fight back. The glen was quiet. Lila hadn't meant to come here, hadn't meant to steal this moment away from the weight of the pack's expectations, the uncertainty of her own place among them. But the forest had a way of pulling her in, drawing her toward its hidden places, whispering secrets through the rustling leaves. Aiden followed. He always did, whether she asked him to or not. The moon was low now, a sliver of silver light that turned the glen into something otherworldly. Soft shadows, the whisper of wind through tall grass, the scent of earth and something wilder. They stood near the center, the hush between them more charged than silence should be. Lila crossed her arms over her chest, exhaling slowly. They don't trust me. Aiden tilted his head slightly. "They don't trust anyone outside the pack." She let out a dry laugh. "Ha ha! Comforting!" He didn't smile, but something in his expression softened. "It's not about you." A pause. Not entirely. Lila turned to him then, frustration bubbling beneath her skin. "Then what is it about?" Aiden studied her for a long moment. Then he reached out, slow, hesitant, and brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. The touch was fleeting, barely there, but it sent a shock through her system, setting her pulse skittering. "This," he murmured. Lila swallowed. The space between them had never felt smaller, had never felt more dangerous. She should step back. She should, but she didn't. Instead, she tilted her chin up just slightly, her breath catching as Aiden's eyes darkened, his focus dropping to her mouth. For a moment she thought he would close the distance. For a moment she wanted him to. Then he exhaled sharply, stepping away, severing whatever had just passed between them. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his shoulders tight. "This can't happen." Lila's heart hammered, her own body screaming at her to ignore him, to close that space again, to see if whatever had just sparked between them would burn. But Aiden was already turning, his voice rough, controlled. "It's late. You should head back." She stared at him, her body still thrumming with something unnamed, something she wasn't sure she had the strength to fight. Then, finally, she nodded, and together they walked back in silence. The small cabin that had been given to her within the pack's safe haven was quiet. Too quiet. Lila sat on the edge of the narrow bed, staring at the reflection in the old mirror mounted on the far wall. She barely recognized herself. Not because she looked different. Her hair was the same, her features unchanged, but because of what lingered in her eyes. Desire, not just for Aiden, for belonging, for this world, for something she couldn't name but felt like it had been waiting for her all along. She exhaled slowly, pressing her hands against her thighs to still their trembling. What had happened in the glen had been nothing, a breath, a hesitation. Aiden had stopped it before it could become anything more. But she had seen the way he looked at her, felt the way his body tensed, like he was holding himself back, and she wasn't sure she wanted him to. Lila closed her eyes, tilting her head back, letting the cool air from the open window wash over her. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The moon hung low now, its light casting long shadows against the wooden floor. She should let this go. She needed to let this go. Because Aiden was right. This couldn't happen. Not when she didn't even know who, what she was. Not when the pack already questioned her presence. Not when her own body felt like it was betraying her, shifting into something new, something she didn't yet understand. Lila opened her eyes and met her own gaze in the mirror. She knew, without a doubt, that she wouldn't walk away from this. Not from the pack, not from Aiden, and that terrified her more than anything. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and earth, thick with the weight of the coming storm. Dawn had barely broken, the first light of the sun painting the sky in hesitant streaks of gold and grey, casting long shadows across the clearing. Lila stood beside Aiden, every muscle in her body tense as the pack gathered before them, their faces hard with mistrust. She had been here before, this place, this clearing, though not in waking hours. It had come to her in dreams, a battlefield drenched in moonlight, the echoes of snarls and growls tangled with the scent of blood and power. Now it was real. A figure stepped forward, broad-shouldered, eyes glinting like steel under the early morning light. Jonas. He had been watching her since the beginning, his gaze always a little too sharp, his silences filled with things he never said. Now, standing before Aiden, his stance rigid with challenge, his voice cut through the morning stillness. "She doesn't belong here." Lila felt the pack shift, the collective weight of their gazes pressing down on her like 1,000 heavy hands. Aiden's posture remained easy, but Lila had seen him fight. She knew how quickly he could go from stillness to violence, how carefully he controlled the force simmering beneath his skin. "She was called here," Aiden said, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable bite of warning. "Same as any of us," Jonas scoffed. "That's not the same, and you know it." His eyes flicked to Lila, cold and assessing. "She's not pack. She's not anything. And yet you let her walk among us, train with us, change us." Lila clenched her fists. She could feel the others shifting behind Jonas, some nodding in quiet agreement, others watching, waiting. Aiden's expression didn't change. "The pack decides who belongs." Jonas stepped closer, voice lowering into something dangerous. "Then maybe the pack should decide who leads." Silence fell like a blade, a challenge. Unspoken but heavy in the air between them. Lila sucked in a breath, her skin prickling with awareness. She had known this would come. She had felt it rising ever since the council meeting. Jonas wasn't just questioning Aiden's choices. He was questioning his right to lead. Aiden exhaled slowly, a measured breath, but Lila didn't miss the way his muscles tensed beneath his skin, the way his fingers flexed at his sides. Jonas was testing him, testing them. Lila swallowed back the sharp, hot coil of frustration in her throat. She didn't need Aiden to fight for her, but he would. And that, more than anything, made her feel the weight of what she had brought here. Jonas tilted his head, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Nothing to say, Alpha?" Aiden's voice was quiet but lethal. "Be careful, Jonas." Jonas bared his teeth, something too close to a snarl curling in his throat. "Or what?" Aiden stepped forward then, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them in a way that sent tension rippling through the gathered pack. "You don't want to find out," he said. Lila could feel it, the way the air shifted, the way the others held themselves taut, waiting. Jonas met Aiden's gaze for a long moment. Then, with a sneer, he turned and stalked away, the others following in his wake. The clearing emptied, but the unease remained. Aiden exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his jaw before turning to Lila. "You all right?" Lila nodded, but the lie sat heavy on her tongue. No, she wasn't all right, because Jonas wasn't wrong. And that was the worst part. The forest was different when she was alone. She had slipped away from the pack's safe haven, needing distance, needing space to breathe. The confrontation with Jonas replayed in her head, his words digging under her skin like splinters she couldn't pull free. "She's not pack. She's not anything." Lila clenched her teeth, dropping onto a fallen log, her hands gripping the rough bark. The forest around her was alive, birds stirring in the high branches, wind weaving through the trees. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like the wilderness was watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. She hated this feeling, the uncertainty, the doubt. Ever since she had stepped into this world, it had been nothing but questions. What she was, why she was here, whether she could ever belong. Aiden believed in her, but that wasn't enough, because the pack didn't. And maybe she didn't either. She exhaled, long and slow, letting her fingers dig into the earth at her sides. The cool soil grounded her, its scent rich and real. She wasn't running, she wasn't giving up, but if she was going to stay, if she was going to fight for her place here, then she needed to be something more than just the girl who didn't belong. She needed to prove herself, to the pack, to Aiden, and most of all, to herself. Lila lifted her head, the wind shifting around her. She didn't know what she was yet, but she was damn sure going to find out. The night was vast. Lila stood in the center of the clearing, the forest stretching wide around her, open and endless beneath the deep indigo sky. The stars burned bright overhead, scattered like shattered glass across the darkness, each one humming with quiet energy. The air was cool, crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. the lingering whisper of the rain that had fallen earlier still clinging to the leaves. She breathed it in, let it settle into her bones. She had spent so much time resisting, fighting against what she didn't understand, what she couldn't control. She had let doubt fester, let fear keep her caged. Not anymore. Something inside her had shifted. She wasn't human, not just human anyway, and she wasn't a werewolf either. She existed in the space between, in the shadow of something ancient and waiting, and for the first time she wasn't afraid of it. A rustling in the undergrowth made her lift her head. She didn't need to turn to know it was Aiden. His presence moved through the trees like something meant to be there, woven into the fabric of the wild, as much a part of it as the wind or the moonlight. She didn't speak as he approached, and neither did he, but when he stepped beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, he didn't ask what she was doing. He knew. The wind shifted, curling around them, stirring the loose strands of her hair. The world felt alive, the ground beneath her feet thrumming with a heartbeat that didn't belong to her, but welcomed her all the same. Lila lifted her face to the sky, the cool night air settling deep in her lungs. For so long she had been waiting for someone to tell her who she was, to tell her where she belonged. She didn't need them to, she knew. A slow, quiet exhale left her lips. Her pulse was steady, her mind clear. The stars wheeled above them, a million burning lights in a sky that had no end. And in that moment, standing at the edge of something she still didn't fully understand, Lila chose. Not because she had no other path, not because she was being forced, but because she wanted this. She turned to Aiden. "I'm staying." His gaze flickered over her face, searching, but there was no hesitation in her voice, no lingering uncertainty in her eyes. Aiden's lips twitched, just slightly. Good. A new beginning. And this time she was ready for it. The pack's gathering place felt different this time. Lila had stood here before, under the scrutiny of wary eyes, beneath the weight of whispered doubt. But now, as she stepped forward, her boots pressing into the damp earth, she wasn't the same person who had once hesitated at the forest's edge. She wasn't afraid anymore. Aiden walked beside her, silent and steady, his presence a constant force at her side. He hadn't asked her to do this. He hadn't needed to. The decision had been hers and hers alone. The pack was already assembled, their murmurs low, uncertain, like the distant rumble of an oncoming storm. The bonfire crackled at the center, its light flickering over the faces of those who had questioned her, doubted her, challenged her. Jonas stood near the front, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Others, Donovan, the elders, those who had kept their distance, watched with guarded eyes. Lila exhaled slowly, letting the tension in the air settle against her skin. Then she stepped forward. "I know what you think of me." Her voice carried through the clearing, stronger than she expected. "I know you don't trust me." A rustle of movement, shifting feet, the quiet crack of knuckles as someone folded their arms. She lifted her chin. "And I get it. I'm not like you." A pause. "But that doesn't mean I don't belong." A ripple went through the crowd, some surprised, some unconvinced. Lila felt Aiden watching her, but he didn't speak. This was her fight. "I didn't ask for this," she continued, voice steady. "I didn't come here looking for a place in your world, but the second I stepped into it, something changed. Not just for me. For all of you?" Jonas let out a low scoff, but Donovan silenced him with a look. Lila took another step closer to the fire, her gaze sweeping over the assembled pack. "I know you think I'm a risk, that I'll make you weak." Her pulse pounded, but she didn't waver. "But I don't want to make you weak. I want to make you stronger." That got their attention. Aiden shifted slightly beside her, his expression unreadable, but there was something there, something like approval. "I know what it's like to not know who you are," she said, softer now, "to feel like you're standing between two worlds, and neither one will claim you." She exhaled. "But I'm choosing this. I'm choosing to stand with this pack." Silence. Then, "She's still not one of us," Jonas said, his voice edged with something sharp. "You can't change what you are." "No," Lila agreed. "But I can change what I become." Jonas hesitated, and in that second of silence, Donovan nodded. "She's right." All eyes snapped to him. The elder's expression was calm but firm. "Change is coming, whether we accept it or not." His gaze flickered to Aiden. "We can fight it, or we can adapt." A low murmur rippled through the pack. Lila swallowed, feeling the shift in the air, the slow unraveling of resistance, the hesitant consideration. Then Aiden spoke. "She stays," he said simply. Not a question, not a debate, a statement. Jonas stiffened, his jaw clenched tight. But he didn't argue. Aiden stepped closer to Lila, his voice steady but edged with something fierce. "She's one of us, now." The finality in his words sent another ripple through the gathered wolves. Slowly, hesitantly, one of the younger pack members stepped forward. A woman with close-cropped dark hair and wary eyes. She glanced at Aiden, then at Lila, and she nodded. A moment later, another stepped forward. Then another. One by one, they acknowledged her. Not all of them, not yet, but enough. Lila let out a slow breath, feeling something settle inside her, solid and unshakable. A new beginning. And this time it was hers. The boundary between the human world and the pack's land wasn't marked on any map. No fence, no signpost, no physical barrier stood between the two realms. And yet, Lila felt it the moment she crossed onto the edge of town. The shift in the air, the faint hum of power crackling along her skin like static electricity. This was where two worlds met, and tonight it was a battleground. The enemy had come. Not humans. Not outsiders. They were wolves. But not Aiden's wolves. Jonas and those who had refused to accept change. They waited in the darkness just beyond the tree line, their figures shifting between moonlight and shadow. Tension rippled through the clearing, the smell of damp earth mingling with the sharper scent of adrenaline and challenge. Aiden stood at Lila's side, his presence steady, unshaken. Behind them, members of the pack had gathered, those who had chosen to stand with them. Not just because of loyalty, but because they had seen the future and they were willing to fight for it. Jonas took a slow step forward, his body humming with restrained violence. "You should have listened, Aiden," he said, his voice cold. "You're leading us into ruin." Aiden didn't move. "No," he said simply. "I'm leading us forward." Jonas's lip curled, his eyes flicking to Lila. "She doesn't belong here." Lila exhaled, steadying herself, feeling the ground beneath her feet, the weight of everything that had led her here. "I do." Jonas's expression darkened. "Then prove it." And just like that, the fight began. The world blurred as Jonas lunged, shifting mid-air, bones twisting, muscles expanding. In the space of a heartbeat, the man was gone, replaced by a massive wolf with deep grey fur and snarling teeth. Aiden moved just as fast. He shifted seamlessly, his own form surging forward. A darker wolf, bigger, faster, meeting Jonas with a clash of snapping jaws and raw power. The rest of the pack erupted into motion. Lila didn't shift. She didn't need to. Instead, she moved. She had spent weeks training, learning to trust her instincts, sharpening herself into something new. Now those instincts roared to life. She ducked under the swipe of another wolf, spinning, using its own momentum against it as she slammed her elbow into its ribs. Another lunged at her from the side. She twisted, catching its scruff, yanking it off balance before driving it into the dirt. She wasn't as strong as them, but she was faster. She was smart. And she had finally stopped fighting what she was. She was pack. The battle twisted around her, bodies colliding, claws raking against the ground. The air pulsed with growls, with the sharp yelps of pain and the heavy panting of exertion. Then, suddenly, silence. Lila turned in time to see Aiden standing over Jonas, his dark fur bristling, his fangs bared. Jonas lay beneath him, chest heaving, blood staining his muzzle. Aiden didn't kill him. He didn't have to. Jonas knew. The fight was over. Aiden shifted back first, his breath still labored, his body lined with sweat and exhaustion. He didn't take his eyes off Jonas as he spoke. "This is your only warning," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "Accept the change. Or leave." Jonas hesitated. Then he shifted, shaking himself off, casting one last bitter look at Lila before slinking back into the trees. The rest of his faction followed. Lila let out a slow, shuddering breath. It was done. Aiden turned to her, his expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, he nodded. She had proven herself. To them. To him. But most of all, to herself. The sun had begun its slow rise, golden light spilling over the trees, stretching long fingers of warmth across the landscape. Lila stood at the crossroads, quite literally. The dirt road before her split into two paths, one leading back to town, to the human life she had always known, the other leading into the forest, into the unknown, into the world that had claimed her in ways she still didn't fully understand. Aiden leaned against the wooden fence nearby, watching her with quiet patience. He wasn't pushing her to decide. He never had. She turned to him, her lips quirking into a small, wry smile. "This was easier when I thought I only had one future." Aiden raised an eyebrow. "And now?" She exhaled, looking down both paths again. "Now I have two." He pushed off the fence, stepping closer, his gaze steady. "You don't have to choose one over the other, Lila." She glanced at him, something flickering behind her eyes. "You really believe that?" Aiden held her gaze. "I believe you'll find a way to be both." Something in her chest warmed. She looked back at the road leading into town, at the future she had once been so certain of. Then she turned to the trees, to the life she hadn't expected but couldn't turn away from, and she realized something. She didn't have to. Lila reached for the bag slung over her shoulder, adjusting the strap. She had a life to return to. College, friends, the dream she had built for herself before she ever stepped into the woods. But she also had a pack. And she wasn't walking away from them. She met Aiden's gaze. "I'll be back." Aiden nodded once, his expression unreadable, but as she turned to leave, his voice followed her, quiet but certain. "I know." The sun climbed higher, light spilling over the path ahead. Lila took her first step forward. A new beginning, and she was ready for it.